The first frost killed her crops and her children. A Lakota chief brought her through the winter. The smoke was wrong. That is the first thing. Not the color. Smoke from a cook fire and smoke from grief looked the same against a gray sky. It was the smell. Too much green wood, burning fast, like someone had thrown on anything within reach without thinking about it, burning slow through the night. I was riding the ridge above the creek bottom, checking the frozen crossing before sending the younger men across with the horses, and I caught that smell and pulled up. My horse felt the stillness in my hands and went still too. Below me, set back from the creek in a stand of cottonwood that had been cleared badly, too much stump, too little shelter, there was a soddy, small. The door hung open, and from the single chimney that smoke came, billowing white and sour, the kind that coughed itself out fast and left a cold house behind. I sat there long enough that the gray in the east started to go pink along the bottom. Then I rode down. I had been chief of my band for 11 years by that winter. 11 years of watching what was coming, not because I was a prophet or because any spirit came to me in a vision and spoke plainly, but because a man who pays attention can read the land the way he reads weather. The soldiers had been moving through in larger numbers since the summer. The forts were being resupplied. The surveyors, the ones in the long coats with their brass instruments, were working west of the ridge now, and they did not look up when we passed. They used to look up. When they stopped looking up, it meant something had been decided that we were not part of. I had been negotiating. That is the word the agent at the reservation used. He was a thin man with ink-stained fingers who smiled with only his mouth, and I did not trust him. But I negotiated with him because the alternative was watching my people die faster instead of slower, and a man chooses his ground. My wife had died the previous spring. Fever. She went in 4 days, and I was not there for 2 of them because I had been at the agency trying to hold the agreement together for another season. I will not speak much about that. What I will say is that when I rode down that ridge toward the wrong smoke, I was a man who had been carrying things alone for a long time. That is not complaint. That is just the shape of what I was. She was inside, sitting on the dirt floor against the far wall with her knees pulled to her chest and her arms around them, not rocking, not making sound, just sitting. The fire had indeed burned itself to almost nothing, a few orange coals showing through ash, and the cold inside that soddy was the specific cold of a space that has given up trying to be warm. On the single rope bed against the south wall there were 2 shapes under a quilt, small shapes, a boy and a girl. I understood without going closer. The way they lay, too still, too composed, told me everything. She looked at me when I came through the door, and she did not scream or reach for anything. She just looked. Her eyes were dry. She had been past crying for some time. I said in English, and my English was good by then, better than most of the agents gave me credit for. I said, "When did the frost come?" She had to work to speak, like the words were something she had to find and carry a long distance. She said, 6 nights ago. I looked at the 2 shapes on the bed. 3 nights ago, she said. She understood what I was looking at. I stood in that doorway for a long moment. The cold was moving in behind me. I stepped inside and pulled the door closed. Her name was Maren. She was Norwegian. I learned this later, learned that she had come from a place where it snowed differently, where the cold was wet instead of this dry bone cold of the plains. And so she had not known to read the sky the way you have to read it here. She had not known that a certain kind of clear night in late October is not a blessing but a warning. Her husband had died of a fever in August. She had stayed because she had nowhere to go and because she had thought, she told me this later, her face very still when she said it, she had thought she could hold it. The crops had been thin even before the frost. A dry summer. But thin crops will get you through a winter if you are careful, if you know how to stretch things, and she had not known. The children had been sick already. Weakened. The frost had come in the night without warning, 6 nights back, And when she had gone out in the morning, the garden was black. Everything black. She had stood there in the frozen mud looking at it, and she had understood what it meant, and she had gone back inside. She had held her children for 3 days. She had been sitting on that floor for 3 days after. I built the fire back up properly. I did not ask her permission. There was no time for the ceremony of asking. I went out and cut wood the right way, the way that would burn slow and clean and hold heat, and I brought it in and I built it up and I put a pot on with the last of what she had in her stores, which was not much, and I sat across from her and waited. She did not speak for a long time. Then she said, "Why are you here?" I said, "I smelled the smoke." She looked at me. I said, "The wrong kind of smoke." Something moved behind her eyes, not warmth yet, something older than warmth. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that someone had seen a thing that was real. She said, "I cannot pay you." I said, "I am not asking to be paid." There is a thing that happens sometimes between people who are both past the place where pretending costs anything. They stop pretending. They become very plain with each other in a way that people who still have things to protect cannot afford to be. That is what happened with Marin and me. I did not tell her everything would be all right. I did not tell her the grief would pass or that God had a purpose in it or any of the other things people say when they do not know what else to offer. I said nothing about it. What I did was rebuild that fire, cook what there was, and sit with her while she ate barely, but some. And then I went outside and I looked at the sky and I thought about the winter that was coming and what it was going to take. She came to the doorway. She had a blanket around her shoulders. She said, "Are you going?" I said, "Not yet." She stood there for a while. Then she said, "They were good children." I said, "I know." She looked at me. She said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because you are their mother, and I can see what you are." She turned back inside. But at the doorway she stopped and she said, and this was the first thing she said that had any life behind it, any real force, she said, "My name is Marin Halvorsen." I said, "I know a little of Norwegian names. Marin is a strong name." She almost smiled, not quite, but almost. I said my name. She tried it and did not get it exactly right, and I did not correct her. The trying was enough. I sent word back to my band. I told them I would be delayed 2 days. My second, a man named Seton, who had ridden with me for 15 years and who understood me better than my own brothers, sent word back that asked no questions. That was Seton. He knew that when I did something there was a reason for it, and that the reason would reveal itself in time. The 2 days became 4. On the 4th day, when Marin was eating again, eating properly, sitting at the table instead of the floor, washing her face in the mornings, I told her what was going to happen to her if she stayed in that sadi alone through the winter. I did not soften it. She listened with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the wall beyond me. Then she said, "What are you proposing?" I said, "My band winters in the canyon 3 hours ride east. There is shelter. There is game. There will be enough." She said, "You are asking me to come live with your people." I said, "I am telling you that you will die here. What you do with that information is your own decision." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "The people at the fort won't like it." I said, "No." She said, "The people at the agency." I said, "No." She said, "Your own people." I said, "Some of them, not all." She was quiet. She looked at her hands on the table. Then she said, "Do you want me there?" I said, "I would not have offered if I did not." She looked up at me, and that was the first time I saw it, the thing that would matter more as winter went on. She had very clear eyes, light-colored, gray-green, the color of river ice where it is thin, and she looked at you straight when she asked something. There was no performance in it. She wanted the plain answer, and she asked for it plainly. She said, "Why?" I thought about that. I said, "Because the smoke was wrong, and I came down, and here you are." A man does not ride away from that. She nodded once slow. She said, "All right." We buried her children first. I helped her dig in the frozen ground. It took most of a day, the ground already hard, and we did not talk much while we dug. There is a kind of work that fills the space that words would only make worse, and this was that work. She said the words over them in Norwegian and then in English, and I stood at the head of the graves with my hat in my hand. When it was done, she went back to the soddy and came out with a bundle. Not much. What she could carry without needing the horse to carry it for her. A blanket, a small Bible with a broken spine, a tintype photograph. She slid this into her coat pocket without letting me see it, which I respected. She had locked the soddy door. I did not understand why she locked it, who would come. But I did not ask. There are gestures people make in leaving that are not about practicality. We rode east. My people were careful with her. I had not expected cruelty. My people are not cruel by nature, and in winter, when survival is a collective project, the luxury of cruelty is one we cannot afford. But I had expected a coolness, a watching, the particular silence that forms around someone who is not known. What I got was something more complicated. The women looked at her. They looked at me. They drew their own conclusions, and I did not interfere with the drawing of them. There was an old woman in our band. She was called Winona, though that was not the name she'd been born with, who had been watching me since my wife died with a specific kind of concern that was both tender and exasperating. She was not my blood relation, but she had known me since I was 11 years old, and she held a grandmother's authority over me that I could not have shed if I'd wanted to. On the first night, Winona came and sat by where Marin was settled near the fire. She did not speak to Marin directly. She spoke to me. She said in Lakota, "She is thin." I said, "She has not eaten properly in 2 weeks." Winona said, "You will need to see to that." I said, "I know." Winona looked at Marin, who was watching the fire with her hands wrapped around a bowl of soup. She had eaten 2 bowls and was working slowly on a third, and Winona said, "She has the look of a woman who has lost children." I said, "Yes." Winona was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She should help with the work, not because we need her to, because she needs to." I said, "I know." Winona looked at me. She said, "You are not as empty as you were last spring." She got up and went back to her fire before I could answer that. Here is what a winter is, when you are living it the right way. It is not waiting. People who live in towns, in houses with floors and walls that keep the cold at arm's length, they think winter is something that happens to you and you endure it until spring. That is not what it is. A winter lived properly is a long, sustained act of collective intelligence and work. You learn what is needed and you provide it. You track the game and you hunt efficiently. Not for the pleasure of hunting, though I will not pretend there is no pleasure in it, but because the meat must last and the taking of each animal is a decision, not an impulse. I am chief. That means I think about these things while other men are sleeping. That means I carry in my head a running count of what we have, and what we need, and how long we can hold on the present rate of consumption, and what needs to happen to change that rate if the weather turns worse than expected. Marin learned this about me slowly. The way you learn things about someone when you are close to them through necessity, not because they tell you, but because you are near enough long enough to watch. She had been there perhaps 3 weeks when she said to me, one morning when the camp was still quiet and I was sitting outside despite the cold, going through the count in my head, she said, "You don't sleep enough." I said, "I sleep enough." She sat down near me. She had learned to dress for the cold properly. Winona had seen to that, with a brisk efficiency that had brooked no argument. She said, "What are you thinking about?" I told her, not the way I would explain it to someone who needed everything translated, but simply the way you tell another person who lives in the same circumstances. The count, the game movement I'd tracked, the section of canyon that was losing its wind shelter. She listened. She asked 2 questions that were not stupid questions. Then she said, I can do that accounting. In my head or on paper, I was good at that. My husband always said numbers were my gift. I looked at her. She said, I'm not saying I know what you know. I don't. But if you tell me what the numbers are, I can keep them. And then you don't have to carry them alone. I sat with that for a moment. It is a strange thing to be offered help by someone you came to help. Not uncomfortable. Strange. The way you feel when the ground you expected to be solid turns out to be different ground than you thought. Not bad ground, just different. I said, all right. She held out her hand. I looked at it for a moment. Then I said, we will need paper. She almost smiled again. She was doing that more now, reaching toward a smile and stopping just short of it, the way a man reaches for a coal and pulls back when he remembers it will burn. She had a small journal in her bundle, 2/3 empty. She had brought it from the Saudi without knowing why. We started the account that morning. There was a night in February, the worst night. A storm came down from the north that was not like the other storms we had weathered. It was the kind of storm that has intent, or seems to. The temperature dropped so fast that the fire in the central pit could not fully compensate, and I went from shelter to shelter through the night checking that everyone was alive and warm enough, carrying coals when I needed to, making my decisions about what we could burn and what we needed to save. Around the 3rd hour of the night, I came to where Marin was sheltered with Winona, and 2 of the younger women and their children. Winona was awake. She had known I would come. Marin was asleep, but she woke when I came in, a light sleeper, or she had become one. She sat up and looked at me in the firelight. She could read my face well by then. She had been doing that account for 6 weeks, and somewhere in the doing of it, she had started reading me the way you read a sky you live under. She said, how bad? I said, bad. She said, what do you need? I said, I need to think. She moved over and made room beside the fire, and I sat down. She did not speak. She did not tell me it would be all right. She did not ask me to explain myself or talk through the problem. She sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her, and she was quiet while I thought. That is one of the greatest gifts you can give someone, to be there and to be quiet. I thought through it, I worked the problem, I made my decisions. At some point in the thinking, I became aware that her hand was over mine on the ground between us, not holding it, just resting there. Lightly, the way you put a hand on a horse's neck when you're standing beside it in a storm, not restraining, just present. I did not move my hand. We sat like that until the storm began to ease. By morning, everyone had come through. Spring is not an arrival. That is a thing you only understand if you have lived through a plains winter properly. Spring is a negotiation, a long, slow argument between the cold and everything the cold has been holding down. You do not wake one morning in the middle of March and find it spring. You wake and the cold is 2 degrees less than the morning before, then 3 degrees. The mud starts at the south-facing slopes and works north. The creek, which has been locked for 4 months, begins to speak under its ice. You can hear it if you put your ear down, a low, cold sound of moving water that has been moving all winter under the weight of the frozen surface. I was at the creek doing this. Yes, an old habit, listening to the water under the ice, something my father had shown me when I was small, when Marin came to where I crouched. She stood beside me. I did not look up. She said, what are you listening to? I said, the water moving under. She crouched down. She put her ear near the ice. Then she said, oh. She stayed that way for a moment. Then, I can hear it. We stayed crouched there together, both listening. Then she said, I've been thinking about what comes next. I said, yes. She said, I can't go back to that Saudi. I said, no, the Saudi is done. She said, where would I go? It was not a question, exactly. It was the thing she had been carrying and had decided to put down in front of me so we could both look at it. I said, there is a town called Harmon's Crossing, 2 days east. There are decent people there. Women who could use an extra hand. You could make a life. She was quiet. I said, there is also a homestead claim, 6 miles from where my band winters. It was filed by a man who died last summer. The claim would need working. A soddy to be rebuilt properly. It would be hard. She said, would I be near enough? I said, near enough for what? She looked at me then. And this was the thing I had been carrying since that February night. The thing I had been turning over in the long dark hours of the early morning. The question of what had grown between us in that winter, and whether it was the kind of thing that survived the thaw or whether it was only warmth sought in the cold, which was real but not the same thing. She said, near enough for you. And there it was. I looked at her. Her face was plain in the early spring light, no performance, asking straight the way she always asked, wanting the plain answer. I said, that claim is near enough that I would know if your smoke was wrong. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, and if it was right? I said, then I would know that too. She nodded, slow, the way she had nodded that first day in the soddy, the decision made quietly without theater. She said, show me where. The claim was filed in her name. The agent at the land office in Harmon's Crossing was a man called Prout, who had the look of a man who had seen enough of the frontier to be past being surprised, but who was not past having opinions. He looked at me when we came in, and he looked at Marin, and something moved across his face that was not friendly. Marin put her hand flat on his counter. She said, I'm filing on the Dunn claim. My name is Marin Halvorson. I have a right to file, and I will file. Prout looked at her. She looked back at him. He filed the claim. Outside afterward she said, men like that. I said, I know men like that. She said, did it bother you? I said, I have been bothered by worse. She said, that's not what I asked. I looked at her. She said, did it bother you that I had to do it instead of you? I thought about that honestly. I said, it is the world we are in. In this world, your name on the paper is more useful than my anger. I would rather be useful. She thought about that. Then she said, you are the least angry man I have ever met. I said, I have been angry. I decided a long time ago that it cost more than it earned. She nodded. She said, I'm still angry about my children, about the frost. About all of it. I said, you should be. She said, you don't think I should let it go? I said, I think you should carry it until you don't need it anymore. You'll know when. She looked at me, that gray-green look. She said, how do you know that? I said, because you are not a woman who holds on past the holding being useful. She turned away, toward where the horses were tied. But I saw her expression before she turned, and there was something in it I will not try to name. You know when something lands in a person. She carried it inside and did not put it down. We rebuilt the soddy in May and June, Seton and 2 of the younger men helping, and I will say that Seton, who had watched all of this with his particular patience, reserving judgment, worked beside Marin without a word of trouble, and by the end of the second week would take direction from her on where the walls should go as readily as he took it from me. This told me something about her. The soddy we built was better than the one she had come from, deeper into the hillside for warmth, the chimney drawn properly, the door faced east, a good root cellar started before the first framing. The last day of the work we ate together outside in the evening light, all of us, Seton and the young men and Marin and me, and there was an ease to it that you do not manufacture. It is either there or it is not. Seton, who was not given to speeches, said to me in Lakota, said it quietly, not hiding it from Marin but not explaining it either. He said, she is good. I said, yes. He said, the winter showed that. I said, the winter shows everything. He looked at Marin, who was talking with one of the young men about the root cellar drainage, and he said, she will hold. I said yes. He said, good, then you will hold. He got up and went to check the horses before I could answer that. He was worse than Winona, Seton was. He had known me too long. There is a last thing. 3 weeks after the soddy was finished, in early July, I rode out to check on her. Not for any emergency, not because the smoke was wrong, but because it had been 7 days since I had, and 7 days had come to feel too long. She was in the garden. She had put in a garden, the right crops this time, advised by Winona, who had made a point of telling her which things could be trusted at this altitude and which could not. The garden was small and careful, and it would not feed an army, but it would feed one woman through a winter if the winter was not too cruel. She heard me ride up, and she stood and turned, and there was dirt on her hands, and her face had color in it from the summer work, and she looked, I do not have a better word for it, she looked like someone who had decided to be alive. She said, I've been waiting for you. I dismounted. She came toward me, not running, just walking, and she put her dirty hands on either side of my face and she looked at me. She said, I didn't say thank you. I said, you don't need to. She said, I know I don't need to, I want to. She looked at me for a long moment, those gray-green eyes straight. She said, you came down when the smoke was wrong. You sat with me on that floor. You brought me through the winter. I said, you brought yourself through the winter. She said, no, quiet but certain. No, we brought me through, and then we brought each other. She did not let go of my face. I put my hands over hers. Her hands were rough from the work, strong. She said, will you stay for supper? I said, yes. She said, and tomorrow? I said, yes. She nodded. She dropped her hands and turned back to the garden, and I tied the horse and followed her, and the summer light lay long and gold across everything, and somewhere under the creek that had been frozen solid all winter the water ran fast and free. I was not an empty man anymore. That is all I have to say about it.